You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Welcome, everyone, to The Sacred Sofa, and welcome back, Brad. It's good to be with you again.
Yes, thank you, Grace. Good to be with you as well. And this is truly one of the favorite parts of my week. And I'm excited about today's episode because I got a lot of thoughts and questions I would love to bounce around with you about this one, Grace.
All right, sounds good. Sounds good. So let's do it. Let's jump right in. As we continue to explore what it means to live well, the good and flourishing life, where are we headed now in terms of Jesus' sermon?
Yeah. Well, we're in a section, right, of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount where he's been talking about personal character or virtue. And so last two episodes, we kind of explored giving or being generous and prayer. Jesus now turns his attention to fasting. And I think this is a concept familiar to many of us, abstaining from food for a period of time. Maybe it's intermittent fasting. That's kind of a big thing these days, or sometimes even a longer period of time, going 1, 2, or more days, right, without food. Now, I do want to get to the practice of fasting momentarily, but something struck me this week, Grace. You see, when Jesus talks about giving, prayer, and fasting, he frames each section by stating that we should do these things in secret. Don't let other people know that we're doing these things. And I tell you, this really got me thinking about the nature of secrets, Grace. Secrecy. There's a quote attributed to SpongeBob SquarePants that cracks me up. He says this: "It's no secret that the best thing about secrets is secretly telling someone about your secret, thereby adding another secret to your secret collection of secrets secretly." That's a bit of a tongue twister, but I love it. It makes me laugh. But I wanted to pass by you. It's kind of a general interest question here, Grace. What do you think about this age-old question? If you were married or in a long-term relationship, let's say, if someone says to you, I need to tell you a secret, Brad, but don't tell anyone. Does that word anyone include my partner, my spouse? Or is it assumed that partners talk to each other about even the most guarded secrets? And I did a few polls with our church community, with some friends. I got some very mixed results here. So I thought I'd start with a general interest question for you, Grace. How should couples navigate boundaries regarding keeping secrets shared by others? Is there an impact of sharing or withholding secrets in a relationship? And can couples ensure trust while respecting the privacy of, say, third parties? What do you make of all of this?
Okay. We're wading into deep waters here now.
Yes.
So, small caveat here. So, first, there's no shoulds. There's no shoulds.
Okay.
However, I do believe it's an important topic for partners, and something in my experience that a lot of folks don't think about or even talk about and discuss. Each relationship is going to have its own unique perspective and boundaries. So this is why I'm saying there's no should, because each relationship is going to be unique. What is important, I think, is that they get on the same page or as close to unity as possible about the topic. I also believe there is a psychological impact on sharing or withholding secrets from partners. Especially, that's why it's so important to discuss what the beliefs are. Because sometimes the conflict comes because, one, there's no agreement on the beliefs around secrets. Right. And then, of course, if someone breaches what you both agreed upon, then, things start to go haywire. Because some people believe there should be no secrets between partners, and others believe on the other side of the spectrum. So It's important that those in the relationship discuss what their beliefs are and then how they're going to navigate that. In terms of the trust piece, I do believe it is a matter of trust and respect if a partner makes it clear that they have information they can't share. But now this is where we get real.
Yeah, okay.
If someone just told you a secret and said, don't tell anyone, why would you go home to your partner and tell them you have a secret?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Because if you weren't actually wanting to actually share said secret,
Mm.
So I think what happens is we actually want to share the secret, and so we just put that out there, and then of course, right? And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
we got to be careful with our own motives here in terms of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that SpongeBob SquarePants quote gets at that. There's something about having a secret or having a piece of information that no one can know.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, oh, that's hard to keep in. And I think maybe some people assume sharing with your partner or spouse, maybe that's just fair game, but it's certainly a murky area. And I totally agree with you. I don't think couples probably talk about this. There's just some
Mm-hmm.
assumptions going on there. So
Yeah. Now, I'm going to add to this though. I do
mm,
believe that sometimes secrets are healthy.
hmm,
So if the information that is going to be shared is going to be harmful, why are we sharing?
right.
We got to check the motives. And to be clear, I'm not talking about things that are important to disclose but are being withheld for self-preservation, because we do that sometimes too, right? It's
Yes,
like,
yes.
right? Some things just don't need to be said though.
Mm,
For secrets told to me, if the person doesn't explicitly tell me not to tell anyone, tend to just use my discretion.
right.
I consider, why am I planning to tell the thing? How is this going to actually help the person or the situation? Like, you have to be
Hmm.
honest about that self, not only your motives, but care for the other person. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, I mean, if somebody puts that caveat in, don't tell anyone. Okay, well, that seems pretty straightforward. I think it's those discretionary moments because, it's interesting doing a deep dive on secrets. There is some real benefits to sharing things that might be perceived as secret, right? If a friend of mine tells me something, and I tell you, Grace, we're exchanging information. There's an
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
intimacy and trust there, power
Yes.
shared. There's all sorts of things that go on there, but yeah, I just find it a fascinating thing to think about, at least for couples. If you want a fun Friday night activity, I don't know how fun that would be, but hey,
Now,
hey.
we're not trying to create our own reality shows here. Like, so for sure, this is an area for partners to navigate. But let's get to the actual practice Jesus mentions here, the
Right.
fasting piece. Why do you think Jesus makes such a list and advises his followers on how to practice fasting?
Yeah, when it comes to fasting as, say, a character formation tool, spiritual formation tool, I got to be honest, it initially strikes me as odd, right? Like,
Mm,
we've just gone through giving and being generous. That makes sense to me. Prayer, I can see how that shapes us, but abstaining from food for, say, 24 hours, it isn't immediately obvious to me how exactly that helps us. And all we really know, we're not really given an instruction in scripture on why it's important. All we know is this: Jesus fasted for 40 days in the wilderness. We know he told his followers to fast, but we're not really told why. All we know
mm-hmm,
for certain is that they did it, they practice it. But again, that makes it even more mysterious in a way. And
mm-hmm,
he says, though, right, like giving, like prayer, he instructs his followers when you fast, not if you fast. So he's just assuming this is going to happen of his followers.
mm-hmm,
But I think we can maybe assume that Jesus assumed himself that his
mm-hmm,
followers would want to participate in the spiritual practices that help develop our hearts and minds.
mm.
But I got to be honest, it wasn't clear to me why until I got a dog. Until I got a dog there, Grace. I'll be
Okay.
honest. I was like, this doesn't make sense to me, but we've had our dog Lloyd now for, oh, I think it's almost 3 years now. And yeah, there's dogs
I
are
love the
interesting,
name, no,
funny.
Lloyd.
Lloyd the dog, yes. And what's intriguing to me, Lloyd will sleep a lot, annoys me a lot, chases squirrels. But if there's one thing that defines Lloyd, it's that the dog will just endlessly beg for food. And
Mm.
the only way to sort of get their attention is to food
Oh.
for anything. They stare at the I can always tell who's the weakest person at the table where the dog is. So if it's by Zoe, my daughter, it's like, oh, are you sneaking food to the dog? I'm just intrigued by how animals are sort of, really honed in beyond dogs into the rest of the natural world.
Hmm.
Procreation, finding food, gathering food. It's like their whole existence. And so I think, in a way, what's going on here, it's a way to separate ourselves from the animal world, our
Hmm.
mammalian instincts, you could say, and remind ourselves, that we're more than just an animal. And,
Mm-hmm.
I was just reminded of this coming through Christmas. That week between Christmas and New Year's I felt like an animal most days. There was no sense of purpose, nothing happening. Everywhere I went, there was 30 snacks on the table, and I was just grazing for no reason. And so I think it's a mistake to overstate our
Hmm.
superiority to the rest of creation. But I do think to fast is to remind ourselves we are image bearers of God, and we're more than just the sum of our parts. We're more than just our biology, more than our impulses and
Mm-hmm.
instincts. So I think it's a fundamental reminder of our spiritual nature. And I think for that reason alone, it's a worthwhile practice. But there's something even beyond fasting here, which brings us
Mm-hmm.
back to the secret part. We know that
Hmm.
sharing secrets is a quick way to earn favor and approval of others. So when Jesus says, do all of your virtues, giving, prayer, fasting, I don't think that's an extensive list, by the way, just 3 examples.
Hmm.
Do it in complete secrecy. So beyond the scope of fasting itself, it seems the real issue for Jesus comes into focus here. Fasting is a good practice for reminding ourselves of our spiritual nature, but there's something else at work. And I think what it is Jesus is emphasizing here the danger of living to win the approval of others.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're overly concerned, because that's what keeping secret would mean, nobody knows what's going on, we're not winning their approval. And Dallas Willard talks about on the Jesus path, the goal is to lovingly, he says, allow other people to think what they will of us and to be free from the control of other people's opinions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, Grace. I know this is some of the ground here we've covered before, but let me ask you here: how much should we care about how others perceive us? When does that become unhealthy? What are some ways to recognize when our actions are motivated, say, by need for approval rather than our own intrinsic values?
Mm-hmm. I like the challenge that Willard gives, but not easy
Yeah,
to do.
no.
So, for sure, in previous episodes, we talked a lot about socialization. So, the influences that are bombarding us with overt and covert messages. And so, it can be extremely challenging to not overly care about how others perceive us. I think
Hmm.
we care, but the key here, I think you're talking about is striving for balance, not to become
Hmm.
overly caring about what people think. I think one key way to recognize when the balance is off is that powerful messenger emotion, anxiety.
Hmm. Yep.
Anxiety, anytime it starts to increase to the point of even debilitating anxiety before, during, or after a social situation, that's a strong indicator that one is so other focused, they can't just relax and enjoy the moment.
Hmm.
I think another way to recognize the imbalance in terms of seeking others' approval is when you're working so hard to shape yourself into what others seem to want. One example I can give is, and I run into this often in my practice, is the pressure to be more extroverted, even though a person is naturally an introvert.
Ah.
Brad, this causes so much
Hmm.
anxiety.
Hmm.
And then all of this comes with intense negative self-talk and self-criticism because you're off center. You're not being truly authentic to who you are.
Hmm.
One of the gifts my mother gave me when I was young, she said, Grace, you can't please everybody.
Hmm.
And that says to me,
Yeah.
she noticed my desire to try to fit in. It was turning me into like a human chameleon, right?
Mm.
And trust
Yeah.
me, it was exhausting. I was
Right.
here and there just trying to please. But getting to that point freed me up to live authentically and then keep growing into that. I've continued to grow into that.
Hmm. I like that chameleon, such a good metaphor, right? Of just
Hmm,
blending in wherever, but how exhausting it is. I'm dying here to ask a follow-up question
sure.
there. I've got a bunch, but I do want to flag, we've got to come back sometime to this idea of in relationships, one person's introverted, one person's extroverted. I can imagine that causes a lot of problems. So I just want to flag someday, let's come back to that.
Yes.
But
Good.
for here and now, I mean, how can we ensure that we're acting authentically rather than performing for others?
Hmm.
And you've already mentioned a bit of this, but what impact does the fear of judgment or criticism have on our personal growth and how we make decisions?
Hmm. I believe there are a few ways. And again, we talked in a previous episode about values. Most recently, we talked about values. Values are the compass that guides how we want to live. So the first thing to do is to identify your values.
Hmm.
I like to say, if you don't know what the destination is, how do you know what to pack in your suitcase?
Yeah.
You know, if I'm going on a trip, it starts with the destination because if I'm
Hmm.
going to Barbados, I'm going to pack something different than if I'm going to Alaska or
Right.
right now in Canada.
Yeah.
Right? And so regular self-reflection, checking in with yourself. Another way to ensure living inside your values is being vulnerable and transparent with and in safe community. We've
Hmm.
talked about this before too.
Hmm.
Folks who are going to provide that valuable and necessary feedback. When fear of judgment and criticism it takes the lead, it's an absolute barrier to vulnerability, which will then stunt our personal growth.
Hmm.
When fear takes the lead, we then allow others to determine our worth and value. And there's a complete lack of self-awareness then that happens, and a person is lost. They don't
Hmm.
actually end up with an internal compass.
Hmm.
I've worked with a lot of clients who struggle to know who they are, what they want. They don't have any a sense of their own personal autonomy because most times they haven't been given permission to do that, usually in childhood, to use their voice and build independence and autonomy. So it's
Hmm.
very important, very important.
Yeah. Yeah. And the pressure is so hard on each of us. And sometimes in those moments, I'm assuming when you're experiencing those big emotions, fear, anxiety, it's probably hard to get yourself into that self-reflecting mode where you're thinking about internal values and whatnot. But how do you think that influences our moral or ethical decisions? And how can we resist it when necessary? Like, are there specific psychological tools that can say maybe help someone navigate when say a feeling of inadequacy that's tied
Mm,
to somebody else's opinion.
hmm I miss my mother. She was a
Hmm.
very wise woman.
Huh. Huh.
So I'm going to show you something else she used to
Yeah,
share with
sure.
me. She used to say, "Show me your company, I'll tell you who you are."
Huh.
And you've talked about this concept before, also
Uh-huh.
reflecting on the sum total of your five closest friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who you invest your time in and allow to invest in you is who you slowly but surely become. And you know what? You can fight against it, but that's how it goes. That's how it
Huh.
goes. And so having regular, what I call audits of what and whom we're taking in, continuously guided by our values, will then allow us to actively resist these influences that ultimately don't benefit us.
Hmm.
There are a few therapeutic interventions I use, and some include exploring and identifying values, core beliefs. Then
Mm-hmm.
we also explore internal dialogue.
Ah.
Often that negative self-talk can actually highlight the subconscious beliefs about self.
Hmm.
And so then identifying these messages, where they come from, and most of these messages are external messages that we then internalize over time.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next step is then to challenge them.
Hmm.
Sometimes they need a reframe. Often they need to be actually replaced with new, positive, inspiring messages.
Huh. Yeah, this you just speaking now, it reminds me of our dialogue last week about prayer, right? And
Mm,
whatever you think of prayer proper, right? I think there's something really here about focusing on some sort of mindfulness practice, whether it's prayer or whatever that looks like for you, but doing the things you're talking about seem to really require some sort of practice around that.
mm-hmm,
And I'm also thinking here of the how beneficial therapy is to start, or maybe even just a good friend at certain points, because a lot of things you're talking about when you talk about interventions or
mm-hmm,
whatever, the value of having an outside source be able to talk to you and say,
mm-hmm,
what is your self-talk saying to you, being able to help maybe guide you. So this all just seems to be affirming a lot of what we've been talking about. But I'm just
mm-hmm,
full of questions today, Grace. I find this all curious, so I have some more for you here.
mm-hmm,
Because one of the things that I can't help but think is to get to this place, you're going to have to at some point come to peace with being misunderstood,
mm-hmm,
so or misjudged by others. So how
mm-hmm.
do you handle being misunderstood? How do you just take that on, misjudged, especially, right, if it's in close relationships? And do you maybe have any strategies to help us stay grounded when we're really feeling that other people's perceptions of us conflicts with how we see ourselves?
Absolutely. If we could all approach every conversation with curiosity, tough conversations can be so much easier.
Mm,
I talked earlier about vulnerability and being in close relationships, and I hope there is always a feeling of safety to be vulnerable, to allow our blind spots to be gently exposed. I've personally been blessed to have many dear friends and often chosen family who will speak into my life, and I've allowed that, right? I've
mm,
invited that. I was just at dinner with my dear longtime sister friend Maureen, and I
mm.
was telling her something, and she literally leaned across the table to me, Brad, and said, "It's not bringing you joy." And we just laughed.
Uh-huh.
And at the same time I was laughing, I was just like, my heart was just full because it was like, I acknowledged she was right. It was a
Mm,
gentle reminder for me to get back on track, right? Why
mm.
am I doing this thing? It's not bringing me joy, right?
Right.
I don't want yes people in my life. The emperor news clothes syndrome, where it's like people just telling you what you think you want to
Yeah.
hear,
Yeah.
right? And I think hopefully we can all be intentional about surrounding ourselves with folks who are going to tell us the truth in love.
Mm.
If we feel safe, we can absolutely start to accept the hard things that are told to us.
Mm. And that's a great story of reinforcing the point, right? Like, yes, we can all have our mindfulness practices, prayer practices, whatever, but occasionally we really do need others to speak into our life. And it sounds like, right, your friend Maureen has such a relationship with you that she can do that in a lighthearted way where you get the point without it
Mm-hmm.
having to be a difficult conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a beautiful thing. So thank you, Grace, for letting me pepper you with a lot of questions this morning because this is, it's always a struggle for me. I think it probably is for most of us in some capacity, figuring out how we navigate life
Mm-hmm.
while also trying to not let other people's expectations or opinions of us dictate how we act and move in life. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you for your wisdom this morning, Grace.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to continue to talk about this and journey with you and I as friends, but
Mm,
also our listeners. And we're hoping that what we're bringing is inspiring you to take a moment, take stock, reflect, and then do the brave thing. Do the brave thing about being vulnerable in safe community. That's the only way we can change and grow. That's the only
mhm,
way we can change and grow. And Jesus knew this. Yes, there's the community aspect, but his call to secrecy, I think, is also an invitation to sit quietly with the
mm.
Spirit to help guide us. Left to our own devices, we can rationalize and excuse, and there's no
Absolutely.
growth there. There's no growth there. And so,
Yeah.
thank you for bringing another topic for us to
Mm,
explore together, Brad. It's always a
mhm.
pleasure. Always a pleasure
Yes,
to
always.
chat with you, and we will absolutely connect again next time.
Absolutely, we will. We'll see you then.
Take care. Take care, listeners.
Bye bye.